Thank you. It's a great pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague Roger Scully on this occasion of his inaugural lecture. An inaugural address is of course a celebration of a professional life, but it's also a recognition of the person behind it. First, let me remind you of the scale and quality of the work for which he has rightly been distinguished by the conferment of the personal chair at the University of Aberystwyth. He's shone in a number of fields, most notably in the subject areas of political representation, legislative behaviour, European politics, especially the European Parliament, and the politics and governance of devolution. Working alongside such figures as Samuel Patterson, Anthony Mugan, David Farrell, Richard Wynne-Jones and David Tristram, he has been responsible for over 70 conference papers, over 30 journal articles, and 20 book chapters in edited volumes. As far as book-length studies are concerned, his name adorns the spines of a number of important works. They include Becoming Europeans, Attitudes, Behaviour and Socialisation in the European Parliament, and with David Farrell representing Europe's citizens, electoral institutions and the failure of parliamentary representation in the European Union. A number of edited volumes are also very notable here, with Richard Wynne-Jones, Europe, Regions and European Regionalism, and with Simon Hicks, at an earlier date, the European Parliament at 50. And with REF in mind, I'm glad to report that forthcoming are, with Richard Wynne-Jones, Democracy in Contemporary Wales, scheduled for 2012. And with Richard Wynne-Jones again, Wales Says Yes, 2011 Welsh referendum. Now, when all that's combined with a succession of grants, awards, positions on editorial boards, and extensive media work, BBC Wales, BBC Radio Wales, BBC Radio 4, as well as numerous contributions to the print media at the national level, it's little wonder that his rise to prominence and distinction has been so rapid. Look at his professional CV. I note that it all started out with a first-class honours degree in politics and international relations at the University of Lancaster in 1992. He was awarded the Reynolds Prize for the leading student in that graduating year. He then went on to do a master's at Durham in European Political and Economic Cooperation, and thence to Ohio State University, where he studied for a PhD. He lived in America for 4 years before he got a job as a lecturer at Brunel University in 1997. He became a lecturer at Aberystwyth University in this department in 2000. In 2004, he became a senior lecturer. In 2006, a reader. In 2007, a professor of political science. I said earlier this is a celebration of a professional life, but it's also a recognition of the person behind it, the real Roger Scully. With that in mind, it's customary for me to give some background context to the formative elements and defining characteristics of our principal figure tonight. Roger has insisted that we need not dwell on this element. He has repeatedly asserted that his has been a thoroughly conventional life's journey. And to back it up, I was served with a super injunction yesterday. So, I've carefully edited. He was born and brought up in Luton. There was a time when he was in Plymouth for a little while, but then most of the time he was born and brought up in Luton, the pride of Bedfordshire. Luton is a place known for the manufacture, traditionally the manufacture of hats, and of cars. Vauxhall cars, Luton vans, Bedford vans, they all come from where Roger used to live. It's also noted for an airport. Been there. It's noted for an international carnival. And I note from Google that the Queen and Prince Philip honeymooned in Luton. It is true. And as you know, it's a hot spot as well for the BNP. My attention was drawn to the history of Luton by something in 1919. Well, my attention's always drawn to 1919 because that's when the department was founded. And it is linked to that because there were peace riots in Luton in 1919. Apparently many people in Luton did not like what the mayor and the corporation had planned for celebrations of Armistice Day. They rioted and burnt down the town hall. Well, I've heard of peacemaking and I've heard of peace building and I've heard of peacekeeping, but never peace riots. This is where Roger comes from. Yeah, Rogers was a far from privileged background. He grew up in quite a tough area of the town. Well, and so you can imagine the sense of achievement when he and his sister became the first members of the family ever to go to university. And as we noted, once he was there, he did go from strength to strength. But let's track back at that point. I mentioned earlier that he was awarded the Reynolds Prize for the leading student in his graduating year. It was presented by the external examiner at Lancaster in that year. And I wonder if you can guess who that external examiner was. His name was Professor Steve Smith, once head of the department here, Woodrow Wilson Professor here, and now Vice Chancellor of Exeter University. When I heard this, the story reminded me of that evocative picture of a young Bill Clinton shaking hands with President Kennedy. The Rose Garden. Bill had been fortunate enough to reach the front of a large group of teenagers on a visit to the White House in 1963. And the picture shows a mesmerized Clinton meeting JFK. It is said that the meeting inspired Clinton's ambition and sense of destiny, that one day he would follow JFK into the White House. And many years later, that is precisely what happened. The meeting of the young Scully and Professor Smith invites speculation over whether history might repeat itself. And that in the future, Professor Scully will end up as Vice Chancellor of Exeter University. Or, to use the Clinton analogy, that Roger might very well follow in the President's own footsteps, and in doing so become the subject of a series of lurid Only time will tell. But back from the future to the present, from my discussions with Roger and in accordance with the terms and conditions of the superinjunction, it is clear that he has four defining attachments. One is to his family, and I'm delighted to say that they are represented here tonight by two Mrs. Scullys, Roger's mother, Margaret, and Roger's wife, Marion. You're most welcome. The second attachment is to, he told me, the blues, which I assumed was the Conservative Party. Or at least Cardiff Rugby Club, but it wasn't. It was to do with jazz. Roger is very, very closely attached to jazz. You can hear jazz music pouring out of his office, actually, as you walk by. But this is a particular mode of jazz, the blues. I didn't really know much about the blues, so I looked it up. I have a marvelous definition from B.B. King. Do you know B.B. King?
Not personally.
B.B. King said that the blues is an expression of anger against shame and humiliation. And I felt this was a deep insight into Roger. The third great attachment Roger has is horses, particularly race horses and women race horses. So I was hoping to report that he had a serious gambling addiction. This would provide an element of sensational revelation, but I'm afraid there's no luck there. Roger has used, or I should say misused, his expertise in probability theory, mathematical modeling, and statistical analysis to good effect. He told me he doesn't lose money on the horses. He comes out ahead. And the fourth attachment is, of course, Wales. His second home for over 10 years, and long enough to be regarded now perhaps as his first home. It's a key element of his work, and he's become thoroughly bilingual. He's deeply enmeshed in the developing civil society of Wales. He's taken Wales to his heart, and I think it's fair to say that Wales has reciprocated. He's become, I think, an adopted son of Wales. And I'm pleased to announce that on May the 5th, not that long ago, news was released that Roger had been elected as a new Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales. This is a very considerable achievement, and well worth a round of applause, I think. Nowhere is this attachment to Wales more marked than in Roger's close working relationship with someone whose face and voice is to many a living testament to the ravages of a nation's struggle. Namely Richard Wynne-Jones, who I'm glad to say is also in attendance tonight. Richard and Roger are leaders of two signature organisations that focus on the government and politics of Wales. In the red corner, Richard's Wales Governance Centre. In the blue corner, Roger's Institute of Welsh Politics. You could see them as great rivals, as the capos of two great media-like, or mafia-like, I suppose, each bent on supremacy. But that isn't the case, or at least that's what Roger told me. Though I should point out that Richard is one of the guests for the dinner tonight, and the seating plan has been organised by the IWP at a restaurant personally chosen by Roger himself. Sounds a nice place. It's called La Cosa Nostra. But the true picture is really one of exceptional harmony and a relationship based upon the strategic doctrine of mutually assured production. According to Roger's CV, Jones and Scully have collaborated on various published pieces, projects and presentation on no fewer than 65 occasions. And this has proved positive of a great partnership, on a par with other examples of parallel lives of historical and cultural significance. You think of Marx and Engels, for example. Cain and Abel, Antony and Cleopatra. Napoleon, Wellington, Wheeler and Booth. Off the tongue. And so when I see the letters R and R, most people think of revise and resubmit. It's Roger and Richard that I always think of. But tonight is different. It's a very singular occasion. Roger is centre stage, and rightfully so. So the time has come for his inaugural lecture as Professor Scully. Now, it's just a reminder before we start that the tradition is, in inaugural lectures, that they remain standalone events entire of themselves. So in other words, there will not be an opportunity for Q&A. Not within the hall, although you can, of course, engage in Q&A outside if you can catch him. So now, with his inaugural lecture entitled Democracy in Contemporary Wales, please welcome the one, the only, Roger Scully.
Mostly kind. And thank you all for being here. I've not expected so many. As T.S. Eliot didn't put it, so many. I had not thought Wales had done so many. My subject tonight, as subtly hinted at in the title, is Wales. In speaking to it, I draw on the book provisionally entitled Democracy in Contemporary Wales, which I'm currently co-authoring with Richard Wynne-Jones, although tonight I'll draw mainly on the chapters that I've drafted. Which is, admittedly, most of them. Our book is intended to be the first systematic analysis of democratic politics in contemporary Wales. It begins, as I will tonight, by addressing a very basic question. What about this topic justifies or demands detailed attention? Or put more simply, why Wales? The politics of Wales has rarely been subject to serious study. There was little tradition of considering Wales an identifiable entity, the important political dynamics of its own. Within the vast literature on UK politics, Wales has typically been viewed as merely part of the Celtic fringe. and not a very interesting part, and thus most often either ignored or merely mentioned in passing. Prominent scholars of politics based within Wales, including our own E.H. Carr, have typically shown singularly little interest in the politics of Wales. Even when serious academic work has been conducted on politics within a part of Wales, itself a rare event, little attempt has been made to speak of Wales as a distinct entity. Only limited and fragmentary attention to Welsh politics is given in other academic disciplines. Explicitly political concerns have been generally rather marginal to the more cultural agenda of Welsh and Celtic studies. Some historical accounts of Wales pay substantial attention to politics, such that one might credibly argue that aspects of late 19th and early to mid-20th century Welsh politics have been analysed more thoroughly than more recent developments. But beyond this and occasional outputs from disciplines like law, one has to go beyond academic literature to the outputs of journalists, political activists, biographers and autobiographers, and these days bloggers, to find politics in Wales taken at all seriously. A serious political science of Wales, a sustained body of work seeking to understand the political dynamics of Wales using the methods of advanced political analysis. This serious political science, by and large, does not exist. Indeed, a casual observer might be forgiven for thinking that Wales constituted a unique political vacuum, given that those who study politics rarely consider Wales, and those who study Wales barely, for the most part, mention politics. How might the neglect of politics in Wales be explained? Well, the most obvious explanation is that until the very end of the 20th century, Wales enjoyed no substantial political autonomy, and Wales itself was of no great importance within the politics of the United Kingdom. With a population constituting, since 1922, around 5% of the UK total, and electing around 6% of members of Parliament, Wales was, and still is, just too small to matter very much. Unlike Scotland, it doesn't have that much oil, and unlike Northern Ireland, within living memory at least, it has also been too quiescent to demand sustained attention. So Wales tended to be ignored. Westminster was the only political game in town, and Wales barely registered as an entity or issue in that game, even if individual Welshmen certainly were key players. A Welsh polity did not exist, and Wales was of little consequence to students of the British polity. A second potential explanation, not incompatible with the first, but certainly more contentious, is that the neglect of serious study of Welsh politics has been highly expedient for many. Because to think about Welsh politics would mean asking what is distinctive about Wales. And this would require addressing sensitive and potentially controversial matters like national identity and language. And this explanation is a negative that is difficult, if not impossible, to prove. But we can at least observe the opprobrium attracted by individuals in the past who have drawn attention to the distinctiveness of Wales. But however justified it may have been previously, the neglect of politics in Wales has become ever more indefensible. There are at least four principal reasons why the systematic study of Welsh politics has become an intellectual priority. First and most obviously, devolution has placed the primacy of a British perspective on political life in Wales into severe question. The establishment of the National Assembly for Wales in 1999, along with similar, though more far-reaching arrangements for Scotland, and later, with more difficulty, Northern Ireland, and the subsequent extension of Welsh devolution through the 2006 Government of Wales Act, and the result of the 2011 Welsh referendum. All this has fractured the hegemony of Westminster in British politics. Politics and government today is no longer a case of for Wales, see England. There is now an identifiable Welsh political system. It is not wholly independent, any more than the political system of the EU, say, is wholly independent of EU member states, but it is distinct and identifiable. Yet we currently know strikingly little about how this Welsh polity has emerged, or what its defining characteristics are. The second important reason for taking Welsh politics seriously predates devolution, but is given greater importance and focus by devolution. Once we begin looking even superficially at politics in Wales, it becomes rather obvious that Wales is very different from the rest of Britain, and particularly England. I do not mean by this that Welsh politics is immune to influence from the rest of the UK. Clearly it is not. But the political landscape of Wales differs so greatly from that of England that to think of Wales as merely a subsection of the wider British political community, or of Welsh politics as British politics writ small, will be to grossly misunderstand, or even to fail to consider at all, defining contours of political life to the west of Offa's Dyke. The third major reason for developing a systematic analysis of Welsh politics is that political life here is arguably in greater need of sustained critical attention than that in most places. In the absence of a body of serious scholarly analysis, characterisations of politics in Wales have long tended to draw heavily on myths and cliches that have rarely, if ever, been properly investigated. Such notions can become, and in the case of Wales, in some instances they manifestly have become, at least partly constitutive of reality. One example, a ubiquitous feature of Welsh political discourse, is the notion of a radical tradition. The idea that the Welsh are and have long been more politically radical in some sense than the English. Yet we were able to demonstrate in the book that empirical evidence for this idea is actually much weaker and more limited than this discourse generally suggests. A defining feature of the political self-image of Wales is thereby rendered distinctly problematic. In Wales, perhaps more than most places, there is a need for a rigorous political science that, as Hans J. Morgenthau once put it, and I quote, cannot help telling society things it does not want to hear. The fourth reason for taking Welsh politics seriously, at least as important as the others I've given, is to realise a hitherto untapped potential contribution of Wales to social science. Much of what makes Wales most obviously different, or perhaps sometimes odd, within the UK, also makes it of potentially wider interest and importance. Two examples here. The first one, Wales differs from England, and also, though in a different way, from Scotland, in the centrality of ambiguities and differences about national identity to its politics. In the famous observation of Raymond Williams, the Welsh are subject to some of the most radical identity confusions of any people in the modern world. This is the nation I've adopted. In a UK context, this makes Wales distinct. To think about such issues, and related ones like differences and conflicts over language, requires analysts to address questions that have been marginal to, and marginalised by, mainstream research on British politics. Nationalism has very arguably been the most important single principle in global politics over the last 3 centuries, yet the study of British politics rarely even thinks about it. And considered in a global context, Wales is but one of many places where nationality and identity questions define the landscape of political conflict and contestation, and one of a smaller number of territories where such issues are played out at the sub-state level. Wales may, at the very least, contribute an important example to developing knowledge and understanding of these phenomena. Second example of Wales' broader potential contribution. Party politics in Wales have long assumed a very different pattern from the rest of the UK, and in particular England. A consistent feature of Welsh politics since the 19th century has been single-party dominance, first by the Liberals, then for most of the 20th century, Labour. In a UK context, the persisting Conservative weakness and the absence of a properly competitive party politics across much of Wales is highly distinctive. But in a broader context, Wales offers a fascinating test case of the peculiarities, and I think we should also say the pathologies, of one-party dominance. To study Welsh politics, then, should in no sense imply insularity, a retreat to the marginal and specific from the broader scale, more general concerns addressed on the wider canvas of British politics. To the contrary, it requires an opening out of the analytic agenda to encompass concerns that are prominent within political study across much of the world, yet have played strikingly little role in analysis of the UK. Taking the politics of Wales seriously should make us less insular in our concerns, not more so. For the remainder of the lecture, I'd like to draw on some of the findings and arguments of our book to consider several key aspects of democratic politics in contemporary Wales. And I will begin at the fairly broad institutional or constitutional level in Wales today, with Wales' current institutional and constitutional status, one of partial self-government, or as we have learned to come and term it, devolution. For much of the 1990s, devolution was often stated, in words generally attributed to the late and much lamented John Smith, to be the settled will of the Scottish people. This statement was validated by the result of the Scottish referendum in September 1997. Devolution, however, then, at that point, could clearly not be said to be the settled will of the Welsh people. The 1997 Welsh referendum mixed apathy and dissensus in roughly equal parts. Half the registered electorate did not vote, and very nearly half the remainder voted no. Nonetheless, as we document in the book, and as was demonstrated in the referendum of March this year, public opinion in Wales has moved a long way since 1997. There is now very limited public support for reverting to the constitutional status quo ante. Partial self-government for Wales is the clear preference of the vast majority in Wales. There remains disagreement and some confusion among the public, just as there is amongst Wales' political elites, as to the precise form that devolution should take. But little more than a decade since Welsh devolution took its first hesitant steps, self-government short of full independence now appears to be the established, settled will of the Welsh people. Some commentators and inhabitants of the blogosphere have interpreted this broad shift in public attitudes as indicating the advance of nationalism in Welsh politics. Some of them, of course, see this as good, many others see this as bad. But all of them, I think, are clearly wrong. For at least two reasons. The first is that, rather obviously, Welsh nationalism is not the only nationalism at play in Welsh political life. It is only one of two principal nationalisms, and historically has been rather the weaker of the two. The other nationalism that has shaped Wales and its politics for decades, indeed centuries, is, of course, unionism. What we might legitimately term British nationalism, had that label not been effectively pilfered by the revolting neo-fascists of the BNP. Now, one might consider the changing landscape of public attitudes and their manifestation in this year's referendum result as an adjustment in the relative balance of power between these two competing nationalisms, a move towards the Welsh end of the spectrum away from the British one. And I'm not certain we can actually even make this case. It's important to recall that for many, though certainly not all, but for many advocates of devolution in the 1990s, the main end to which devolution was primarily directed was the continued legitimation of the United Kingdom. The political strategy was in the broad tradition of, say, Gladstone's agenda for Irish Home Rule in the 19th century, and might fairly be termed unionist devolutionism, granting partial self-government to some constituent nations in the UK, in order that the Union as a whole might be more securely maintained for the longer term. Now, the use of devolution as a means of legitimating the UK was clearly crafted largely with Scottish circumstances in mind. Whether it has been entirely successful there in this strategic aim remains open to some doubt. The leader of the Scottish Labour Party in the mid-1990s claimed that devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. It is not self-evident that George Robertson called that one right. In Wales, any need to legitimate the UK during the 1990s was certainly far less pressing than in Scotland. Public support for independence in Wales was much more limited. Wales leaving the UK was not a realistic prospect. And some opposed devolution for Wales on the grounds that it might loosen links with the rest of the UK, perhaps start Wales on a slippery slope towards political separation. Well, I mean, if you wholly buy into what we might, if we were trying to be pretentious, call the ontology of slippery slopism, if you wholly buy into that, then the changes in public attitudes over the last decade and a half and the result of the March referendum, well, they do show further movement in that direction. The worst fears of such people on this viewpoint are some of the way to being realised. But while public support has grown for the National Assembly for Wales to receive greater powers and to be the most influential level of government in running Wales, it does not necessarily follow from this that the legitimacy of the UK is being challenged in Wales. Indeed, this might perhaps be better interpreted as indicating the success of unionist devolutionism. Public support for Welsh independence, as we show in the book, has not grown at all since the 1997 referendum. Indeed, if anything, it's shrunk. And the best survey evidence suggests that public attitudes towards the political system and structures of the UK have, notwithstanding expensive scandals and the like, actually become more positive during the devolution years. The UK was not facing a substantial legitimacy crisis in Wales in the 1990s. But devolution may have, at least, have helped to forestall any incipient problems. And it certainly does not appear to have launched Wales down any slippery slope that gradually erodes support for the United Kingdom. Ironically, a unionist devolutionism, crafted largely for Scottish circumstances, may actually be having greater success in Wales. I'd now like to move on to discuss a somewhat related fear for some and hope for others that people had about devolution in Wales. This is the idea that establishing a specifically Welsh level of government would make the people of Wales more Welsh in some fundamental sense. The precise mechanism by which this might happen was rarely stated explicitly, but generally seemed to involve the fact that the creation of Welsh-level political institutions leading to a greater Welsh centricity of much of public life. And this in turn, over time, prompting substantial sections of the population to come to affirm a more exclusively Welsh sense of national identity, and for their sense of attachment to Britain to gradually, slowly corrode. Some talking about this have pointed to the decline in reported levels of British identity evident in surveys over recent times in Scotland. Apparently failing to notice that this decline in British identity in Scotland almost wholly predated the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. Meanwhile, an award-winning, and on the whole justifiably award-winning analysis of the politics of the British Union a few years ago asserted that the Welsh had become more supportive of devolution because of a rise in levels of Welsh identity, rather eliding the fact that they presented absolutely no evidence to support this assertion. It is clear from the empirical evidence that we examine in our book that there is no necessary relationship between national identity on the one hand and political attitudes on the other. Nor does national identity necessitate support for particular political parties. It is important not to equate Welsh national identity with support for self-government or for Plaid Cymru. The relationship between national identities and political attitudes in contemporary Wales is far more nuanced and contingent than that. Those who affirm a more Welsh identity, however that is measured, are substantially more likely to favour greater self-government for Wales than those choosing a more British identity or other national identities. This is a consistent, empirically observable relationship. But many people affirm a Welsh identity without favouring independence for Wales, even in some instances without favouring any measure of self-government for Wales at all. And the considerable growth in support for self-government for Wales over recent times cannot be explained through any rise in levels of Welsh national identity. A more Welsh identity does correlate positively with support for greater self-government in Wales at any single point in time for which we have evidence. But as we demonstrate in the book, the proportions of people in Wales claiming different national identities, whether they be Welsh, British, English or any other, those proportions have remained remarkably, indeed almost spookily, stable over the last 3 decades and more. Even while public preferences over how Wales should be governed have altered dramatically. The people of Wales have become more Welsh in their desired centre of government, but as best we're able to measure it, they have not become any more Welsh in their fundamental sense of identity, in their basic sense of who they consider themselves to be. National identity is an important influence on many political attitudes in contemporary Wales, but that causal influence is much less absolute than many may suspect. And I would suggest that the greatest impact of national identities, and in particular the Welsh identity affirmed by a majority of people in Wales, the greatest impact of this has come not through any causal relationship, but in what one might perhaps term an existential sense. A distinctive Welsh identity does not demand political expression in any particular form of government. Throughout recent decades and even centuries, many Welsh people have seen no need for any political manifestation of Welsh distinctiveness. But the persistence of a Welsh identity and a sense of Welsh nationhood at least made it possible for the question of how that Welsh nation should be governed to be asked and periodically re-asked. Without such a persisting form of identity, it is highly unlikely that there could ever have been a serious and ultimately successful political movement seeking devolution for Wales. Any campaigns for Welsh self-government would probably have remained as sickly and underdeveloped entities as those in support of English regionalism. At one of the lowest points for modern Welsh nationalism, in the aftermath of the crushing referendum defeat of 1979, the historian Gwynalf Williams wrote in quasi-apocalyptic terms of the Welsh having become the first people in history to vote themselves out of existence. Williams and many others believed the overwhelming rejection of devolution in the 1979 referendum was the harbinger of the end the end of a distinctive Welsh culture and a distinctive Welsh national identity. Yet subsequent years have shown this view to be almost wholly and entirely incorrect. The level and strength of Welsh national identity persisted more or less entirely intact and unchanged after 1979. And though the people of Wales rejected self-government emphatically in that first referendum, the persistence of the collective idea that there is a nation called Cymru, or Wales, allowed for the question of how that nation should be governed to be revived and re-asked, and for a new generation to deliver a rather different answer. In this way, perhaps more than any other, national identity has defined politics of contemporary Wales. But what sort of political nation is Wales? I hear you cry. Well, one of its defining characteristics has long been a proclaimed radicalism. As mentioned earlier, invocations of the Welsh radical tradition are many and various. Yet, as I also mentioned earlier, we were able to show in the book that the contemporary evidence to support this idea is more limited and partial than often suggested. It is true undoubtedly that since the latter 19th century, the Welsh have consistently voted for parties broadly of the left in greater proportions than the English, or the Scots. It is also true that the Welsh tend to regard themselves as being more left-wing than the English, that the Welsh are more likely to be members of trade unions, and they're more likely to identify themselves with the working class. Yet, as we show in the book, all this has strikingly little apparent consequence for the actual social and political attitudes that the Welsh possess. When these attitudes are examined systematically, using measures of both socio-economic and more social, libertarian, authoritarian attitudes, the evidence pretty clearly does not suggest that the people of Wales are more radical in any sense than the Scots or the English. Indeed, on social issues, the Welsh actually tend towards somewhat greater levels of authoritarianism. Young people should do what they're told. When we look in more detail within Wales, there is a very modest association between an individual's likelihood of affirming a strongly Welsh national identity and of endorsing more left-wing attitudes. There's a relationship there. It is difficult to deduce any causal link here. Welsh national identity is significantly intertwined with class identity, and in purely statistical terms at the very least, it is class identity that far more effectively accounts for more radical political attitudes. Why this disjuncture between voting behaviour and political self-image on the one hand, and political attitudes on the other? Well, part of the explanation is almost certainly specific to the historic failure of Welsh conservatism, something that I've learned a great deal about from Thomas David Davies, who is here tonight. Across much of Wales, the Conservatives have long been viewed as an essentially English political force. Welshness and anti-conservatism have often appeared to be, if not exactly the same thing, then at least highly correlated. And at times, Welsh conservative has seemed to verge on being an oxymoron. It is thus unsurprising that many Welsh people who knew that they were not conservatives have come to associate themselves with labels antithetical to conservative values, even if their own attitudes were actually perhaps some way from being radical on most understandings of the term. A second, though related point, has previously been made by my co-author, drawing on the work of the Czech theorist Miroslav Hoc about the incomplete class structures that can develop in non-state nations. Put much more crudely than Richard would put it, the tendency of upper social classes to identify with the official state nationalism, in this case Britishness, can mean that identity with the stateless nation, Wales in this instance, can become intertwined with working class identity and with the political forces that are linked to that class identity. Perhaps even among people who, on any objective measure of social status, have long since left their working class roots behind. The Welsh are every bit as capable as anyone else of falling into comforting self-delusion, and such delusions can be at least partly self-sustaining. The notion of Welsh radicalism has helped construct the politics of Wales in various ways, including underpinning the long hegemonies of the main anti-conservative parties. And it has thereby helped to lead the persistence in Wales of an unbalanced, one-party dominant form of democratic politics. And such things have their costs. One-party domination has almost certainly been damaging to Wales. I say this not primarily because of specific shortcomings of the Labour Party, and even less to encourage you to all go out and vote Tory. I say it because sustained dominance by any single party is emphatically not a desirable state of affairs. It is not something anyone should wish for their country. Those inquiries conducted into instances of long-standing single-party dominance within democratic political systems show one-partyism to be strongly linked with phenomena such as widespread corruption and intellectual stagnation. It would perhaps be heroic to suggest that these phenomena are wholly foreign to the Welsh experience. Elections to the National Assembly for Wales have, partly, mainly because of the electoral system, been less unbalanced than those to Westminster. But still, here we are in the fourth term of the Assembly, and there's never been a non-Labour government in Cardiff Bay. Perhaps casting off, or at least questioning, some comforting illusions about our supposedly innate radicalism in Wales might be one step towards creating a less lopsided, more competitive and more pluralist, in short, a more healthy form of democracy in contemporary Wales. Before I close, it would be very remiss of me to fail to say at least 3 sets of thanks. The path from Berry Park in Luton to Director of the Institute of Welsh Politics at Aberystwyth is not the most commonly followed in life. That I've been able to follow it is due in considerable part to many people, and tonight offers an appropriate place to acknowledge this. First of all, I thank my family for love and support received over many years. I'm delighted that Marion and my mum could be here tonight. And I know how much we would all have wished for my dad to be able to be here as well. Second, I must acknowledge the many teachers, fellow students, colleagues and students at Lancaster, Ohio, Brunel and in Aberystwyth, who have provided support, encouragement and intellectual inspiration, often almost certainly without realising it. Indeed, in a few cases, they'd probably be horrified if they realised it. They are far too many to name, though many of them here tonight. But that in no way lessens the debt that I owe them. That I'm here tonight talking about Welsh politics, however, is due in considerable part to 2 remarkable people, Gwennan Cranant and Richard Wyn-Jones. I'm delighted they're both here tonight. One of the greatest privileges of my life is to be able to call them both my friends. I'll finish with some words from the Irish essayist Hubert Butler. Obviously. Butler was writing in the 1950s about work he and colleagues were doing on Ireland. However, they also capture the spirit that I believe can and should underpin a serious political science of Wales. We shall aim at being serious without being self-important. We shall not be in the least afraid of being thought provincial. We live in a small country, but its problems are complex and interesting enough for the most ambitious intelligence. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Nostra.
to get us to eat more fruit and vegetables. I was reading the other day that the same principle is about to be extended to mental health and intellectual well-being, i.e. that we should adopt an equivalent 5-item-a-day stimulation regime for our minds. And the food guru advocating this calls these items mind apples. I think we can all agree that we've had our full quota of mind apples, not just for a day, but for many weeks and months to come. It's a veritable orchard, I think. I think it takes an especially enriched scholarship to wander so effortlessly and yet authoritatively across such wide historical, political, social and cultural terrains, and that he can do so with such panache for insight and coherence, and accessibility is a testament to an often understated yet formidable mind at work. So for your lecture tonight and for your contribution to the department, as well, I might say, it's for your generosity of spirit to many, may I, on behalf of the audience, offer our collective gratitude for all of us here tonight. Thank you very much for watching.